This is going to be the last video I am going to make covering patch 1.13, today covering the 7 different sorceries that did get changed, all of which got buffed except for Impenetrable Thorns, which actually did get a very significant nerf. And instead of doing the entire sorcery tier list all over again, I'm just going to rank these 7 and put them in a tier list based on how useful they are and how well they perform in PvE. But yeah, let's just get into it. Now to start off with, Glintstone Nail actually did get an improvement to tracking and its damage. Now this spell is not bad by any means. In fact, it's probably the most efficient sorcery in the entire game because for only 10 FP you get a very high damaging projectile that can go very far and also track very nicely. There are no other sorceries that cost around about this much FP that do as much damage. Now the thing is, when you're using these types of efficient spells, they typically are better earlier on in the game, because you're not going to have much mind, but being that you get this in the DLC, you're going to be at a pretty high level anyway, and with a sorcery build, you're probably having at least 25 mind, and at that point, you can afford to use a bit more expensive spells. Just something that's going to consume like about 7 to 10 more FP is just going to be much more beneficial, because it's going to result in much higher damage and much more DPS, because that's another downside about the Glintstone Nail, is that it cannot be spammed. Other types of spells, you can continuously use it over and over again and combo them back and forth. But the Glintstone Nail doesn't really work that way. So there might be some types of specific builds out there that will benefit of using this type of spell, but with most caster builds, I wouldn't really bother. The Vortex of Putrescence spell did actually receive a damage increase and a boost to its Frostbite buildup. Now from my testing, it actually does roughly 180 frost. And the spell is actually very easy to use. The spell actually does shoot out like a projectile and explode in an AoE. Now the projectile is not going to go that far, so don't really look at it as like a ranged-based AoE attack. If you did want something like that, there are going to be better options out there. But the major benefit is that it is going to be a quick cast, and enemies that do like to move and dodge around are more likely than not going to get hit by it, and it is going to proc frost. But I do have a few problems with it. One, it's just not very cheap at all. 29 FP cost, 26 faith requirements, and takes up 2 slots. Not going to be the easiest thing to build around. And if I did want an AoE spell that's pretty close range, I would use things like Gravitational Missile, and if I wanted to proc Frost quickly, I could use Zamor Ice Storm, because this spell could do like 5 times as much Frost buildup and do way more damage, especially when fully charged. So it does do a few things well, but it still doesn't do enough to actually make me justify putting it into my build. GLINTBLADE Trio did actually receive a damaging boost, and the spell does feel a lot better now, and for only 19 FP, it definitely can be one of the more efficient options. It is a spell that has like a delayed effect, so against enemies that do like to input read and animation read, it's going to be a lot better. Now unfortunately, the projectiles don't really get much tracking, so against faster enemies, they're still just going to dodge it. But I think the biggest downside of this spell is that it's a single target magic damaging spell, which we have like 1,000 of those things in this game. So therefore, it has to compete with Night Comet, and Night Comet does basically just as much damage for only a couple more FP, and that spell is invisible, so it can't be dodged, can be spammed over and over again, and it's just going to be much easier to use. I feel like this type of spell's whole gimmick should be like doing a lot of stance damage, because if it did do something like that, I'd justify using it a lot more, but unfortunately, it's just a very basic magic projectile attack. Glintstone Nails is actually going to be one of the better tracking projectiles in this game, as it did receive a damage boost and a tracking boost. And with all the different types of finger boosting items in this game, it can also result in pretty nice damage. Now I think the most underrated part about this spell is going to be its stance damage. When fully charged, it can do 24 stance damage. And for how quick that you can cast it and for only 23 FP, it definitely is worth it. Now, once again, the major downside is going to be that it's a single target magic projectile option. So therefore, it has to compete with many different other types of spells. When making your build, you always want to have like one for every single different scenario, like a close range spell, an AoE spell, different damage types, and you obviously want like a single target projectile option. There's not really much of a need to have multiple of the same types of spells, and Glintstone Nails is just not going to compete with Night Comet at all. It is going to get better tracking, but there's no need to get better tracking when you're a spell that's invisible. Glintstone Nails is going to get like a little bit more damage, but Night Comet is cheaper and it's much quicker to spam, so it's hard to justify using Glintstone Nails over Night Comet. But if you did want to go into like a finger sorcery type of build, and you were using something like Fleeting Microcosm as like a nice AoE option, and you had things like the Maternal Stuff in your offhand and the finger robes on, then you might as well just use the Glintstone Nails as your primary option too. But outside of that type of build, I probably wouldn't use it much. Impenetrable Thorns did receive a very big nerf to its stance damage, its bleed buildup, and it actually did get a bit better tracking as of this recent patch as well. Now, I did do an entire playthrough with this spell on stream today from start to finish, including the DLC, and I have lots of opinions on it. This thing can still very well just like melt a whole bunch of enemies and bosses in this game, but there also is like a bunch of instances to where like this is the worst spell to use. It's like awful in so many different cases. Now, the nerf did decrease its stance damage to about like roughly 10 to 15 stance per hit, so it's basically not going to proc a stance break on most bosses in this game. The bloodlust split up is now only 150 bleed, and I did actually test it out with the maternal staff at 50 arcane, and it was doing roughly 350 bleed. But you're going to be doing a lot less damage, so I would just rather just go all into damage with an intelligence build when using this spell now, unless you're at those really high amounts of levels. But the spell still goes really far, the damage is still really good, it still only consumes 15 FP, plus like the little bit of HP that you lose every single time. And if enemies are at that sweet spot at that distance, it's just going to perform very nicely. Now, there are so many downsides that I can say about this thing, and so many inconsistencies that will just stop me from putting it into the S tier. But if you're fighting on a hill or in stairs, it's just gonna suck. If you're using this spell at closer ranges against these like smaller enemies, it can just straight up miss. I don't know why, but like this spell, it just does not explode. The tracking still sucks, but yeah, the hit detection is just the worst part about it. There are so many cases, especially against larger bosses, to where it just explodes in front of them, or it explodes not even close to where they're at. Like, I don't know why the spell works like this. I don't even know how you would fix something like this as well. Like, even when enemies are like just moving the slightest bit forward, it's just going to explode behind them. And my biggest issue with this spell is that enemies have to be standing directly in the middle to benefit off that damage. If they just get hit by like the edge of the AoE, they're basically taking no damage. Hopefully they make it to where like when you get hit with the outside parts of the AoE, you can still get maximum damage. That will just make it a lot more consistent, because there's so many times where I use this spell and it's just going to be doing shit damage. It feels like it's just RNG every single time I click the button. But I think that's like the only thing it's lacking. That and like the stupidly long recovery animations. Like, it takes forever to stand up when you use the spell. But I guess it is like a little bit of balance. But in terms of its damage, its bloodlust split up, I'm perfectly fine with it. And I think the nerfs are actually okay, but just mechanically the spell just performs like shit. Rings of Spectral Lights now has received an increase in terms of its damage and its frost buildup. Now, from my testing, when uncharged, it does roughly 100 frost buildup, and when fully charged, it's 140, which is going to be on par with things like Glintstone, Icecrag, and Ardala's Moonblade. But it actually can just do more damage, and best of all yet, it goes incredibly far. Like, I think this is an S tier spell in this game now, because the damage increase is very nice, and you can pair it alongside the Gravebird helmet to just make it do 10% more damage. Now, unfortunately, it still doesn't work with the Prince of the Death Staff. I'm not sure if that's intended or not, but if that does get changed, it would be an additional 10% more damage. But honestly, if you're running a sorcery build, I would just throw on this build almost every single time, because it's going to be your best sniping option, because it's easy to spam, it's only 14 FP, it has a little bit of a delayed effect, so enemies aren't really going to be able to dodge it as easy. You're going to be doing some very decent frost buildup, and you can fully charge it for even more damage. Like, I don't know how a spell like this ended up only costing 14 FP, but I'm gonna take it every single time. I think this thing is just incredible. Now, to what I consider the most improved spell as of this recent patch, it's going to go to Blades of Stone, which I actually liked before the update, but it's just way better now. The uncharged version now just does more damage, and as for when fully charged, they did actually rework the distribution of damage between every single attack to where like the first hit does the most damage, and the attack just goes a lot further and actually comes out a bit faster too. But yeah, with this change, I consider this to be the best physical damaging sorcery in the game, which is actually a big deal, because every single time that you're picking your spells, you always want to have good variety, and that is going to include damage types. Because beforehand, I would have just liked to have Rocksling as a nice physical option, but now the uncharged version of Blade of Stone does more damage than Rocksling and consumes just as much FP. It's also going to be quicker, and it's more consistent at closer ranges, and going to do it in a larger AoE too. Now, Rocksling is still going to go further. It's still going to be better at hitting those enemies that like to move and dodge around, because it does have a little delayed effect. And it still is obviously going to do more stance damage, but Blades of Stone can be fully charged, and this fully charged version does actually grant it so much more versatility to where I'm just going to prefer it as the better physical option, because not only can it just make it do upwards of 3 times as much damage, but it is also going to work as a nice stun locking tool. So against those smaller enemies, or if you're surrounded by a group of enemies, you could just use the attack fully charged, and it can just continuously stun lock them. Now, I think the major downside of this spell is that it does take up 2 whole slots, but it actually can be used multiple different ways. You can use it as an AoE spell, you can use it as a single target projectile spell, you can use it as a stun locking tool, and you could do all that for only 18 FP cost. I definitely think this is one of the best sorceries in the game. Anyway, that is that done. Now, as for the next video, I'm probably going to go back to making more builds. I kind of want to go cover 5 different dexterity builds based on the DLC weapons. and also do 5 strength ones as well. So if that does interest you, definitely do like and subscribe, and definitely do follow me on Twitch because that's where I do all of my testing and all of my different challenge runs. But yeah, catch you guys around. See ya.